Today I will explain what sleep-deprived people did in medieval times. Now let's start. In the medieval world, night was not a quiet thing. Darkness did not bring rest the way we imagine it today. When the sun slipped behind the hills and the last orange light faded from the sky, life did not fully stop. For many people, night was long, cold, loud, and uncertain. Sleep came in pieces, not in one smooth stretch. And because of this, sleep deprivation quietly shaped medieval lives in ways few people today truly understand. Imagine a small village in the year 1200. There are no streetlights, no clocks glowing on walls, no soft hum of electricity. When night arrives, it arrives completely. The only light comes from fire, flickering candles, smoking oil lamps, and hearths that must be carefully guarded. Fire is precious. It gives warmth, keeps animals away, and makes the dark feel a little less dangerous. But it also demands attention. Someone must stay awake to tend it, or it will die. For peasants, sleep was often dictated by survival. Most went to bed soon after sunset, not because they were tired, but because there was nothing else to do. Reading was rare. Entertainment was limited. Darkness pushed people toward rest, but sleep did not last. After a few hours, many woke up naturally. This was common. They called it first sleep and second sleep, though they didn't use those exact words. Waking in the middle of the night was normal, expected, and sometimes necessary. During this waking time, sleep-deprived people did many things. Some prayed quietly, believing the night hours were closer to God. Others talked, whispered stories, or reflected on dreams. In crowded homes, with entire families sleeping in one room, this half-awake time was often filled with murmurs, sighs, and restless movement. True silence was rare, but not everyone had the luxury of waking calmly. For many medieval workers, sleep deprivation was forced upon them. Bakers rose long before dawn to prepare bread for the day. Their nights were short, broken, and exhausting. Watchmen stayed awake to guard town walls, pacing back and forth in the cold, fighting heavy eyelids. Their job was to listen for danger, footsteps, whispers, the sound of steel, while their bodies begged for rest. Monks and nuns lived under strict schedules that often robbed them of sleep. Night prayers were mandatory. Bells rang in the dark hours, pulling them from thin blankets and hard beds. They believed that denying the body rest brought the soul closer to God. Fatigue was not a problem to be solved. It was a test to be endured. In castles, sleep deprivation took on a different shape. Lords and ladies slept with one eye open. Political danger was constant. Assassination, betrayal, and sudden attacks were always possible. Servants moved quietly through hallways at night, carrying candles, listening for sounds that didn't belong. Guards stood at doors and towers, their minds dulled by exhaustion yet expected to react instantly if trouble came. Then there were the sick. Medieval medicine was limited, and illness often meant long, painful nights without sleep. Fever dreams, coughing, and pain kept people awake for days. Without effective treatment, exhaustion piled on top of sickness, weakening the body further. Families watched helplessly as loved ones drifted in and out of consciousness, unable to find true rest. The poor suffered the most. Their homes were cold, damp, and crowded. Rats scratched inside walls. Animals shared living spaces. Babies cried. Hunger gnawed at the stomach, making sleep shallow and uneasy. Sleep deprivation was not a rare condition. It was a constant companion. Night was also a time of fear. Darkness meant danger. Wolves roamed outside village boundaries. Thieves took advantage of shadows. Fires could break out unnoticed. Many people stayed half awake by instinct, listening for sounds that signaled disaster. This constant alertness wore down the mind. People were tired not just in body, but in spirit. And yet, medieval people adapted. Their lives bent around broken sleep. They rested when they could, leaned against walls, sat by fires, closed their eyes during quiet moments. Daytime naps were common, especially during long winter months. Sleep deprivation was accepted as part of life, not a medical problem, not something to complain about. Still, the effects were real. Short tempers, slow reactions, strange dreams, and deep superstition all grew stronger in tired minds. Exhaustion blurred the line between reality and imagination. Shadows seemed alive. Sounds felt meaningful. And in a world already filled with mystery, lack of sleep made everything feel more intense. As the medieval night stretched on, filled with whispers, prayers, and watchful eyes, sleep deprivation quietly shaped beliefs, routines, and fears. And as we move deeper into this world of broken rest, we begin to see how exhaustion didn't just change how people slept, it changed how they thought, how they worked, and how they survived. When the medieval night deepened, something strange happened to the human mind. As hours passed without proper rest, thought slowed, senses sharpened in odd ways, and imagination quietly took control. Sleep deprivation did not just make people tired. It changed how they understood the world around them. In a time already filled with mystery, exhaustion became fuel for fear, belief, and unseen forces. Most medieval people did not sleep deeply. Their rest was thin, fragile, easily broken by noise, cold, or worry. When they woke in the middle of the night, the world felt different. Shadows seemed heavier. Silence felt louder. The mind, half awake, half dreaming, slipped into a strange state. This was the hour when many believed spirits moved freely. Sleep-deprived villagers spoke of hearing footsteps outside their homes, only to find no one there. Others felt pressure on their chest, unable to move, convinced something dark sat upon them. Today we might call this sleep paralysis. Back then, it had a name, a story, a face. People believed it was a demon, a witch, or a night spirit stealing breath. Exhaustion made these experiences feel real. When the body is deprived of sleep, the brain struggles to separate dreams from waking life. Medieval people had no science to explain this. They only had stories passed down for generations. And those stories filled the gaps left by tired minds. Monks wrote about visions during late-night prayers, flickering candlelight, echoing chants, and heavy eyelids combined into powerful hallucinations. Some believed they saw angels. Others believed demons whispered temptations into their ears. Sleep deprivation was not seen as the cause. Instead, these moments were treated as divine messages or spiritual attacks. For common people, superstition grew strongest in the darkest hours. Exhausted shepherds guarding animals overnight claimed they saw glowing eyes in the fields. Tired mothers swore they heard babies crying when their children were asleep. Watchmen on city walls sometimes rang alarms after mistaking fog or moving shadows for enemy forces. Fatigue made mistakes deadly. Witches, too, were born from sleepless minds. When people woke disoriented and frightened, they searched for reasons. A neighbor who acted strangely. A woman who lived alone. Someone already whispered about. Sleep deprivation blurred logic, allowing fear to turn into accusation. Nighttime experiences became proof of dark magic at work. The belief in night spirits was widespread. Incubi, succubi, fair folk, restless dead, all were said to appear when sleep was broken. These stories were not entertainment. They were explanations. A tired mind needed answers, and medieval culture provided them in vivid detail. In households, sleep-deprived parents warned children not to wander at night. Darkness was believed to belong to things that should not be seen. The idea that evil was strongest after midnight became deeply rooted, and because so many people were awake during these hours, these beliefs reinforced themselves again and again. Even dreams changed under exhaustion. Medieval dream interpretation was serious business. Dreams were believed to predict death, war, and divine will. But sleep-deprived dreams were fragmented, intense, and disturbing. People woke shaken, convinced they had been warned. A bad dream after little rest could alter decisions, delay journeys, or start conflicts. Physically, lack of sleep weakened people. They grew clumsy. Tools slipped. Horses were mishandled. Fires were left unattended. Accidents increased at night and early morning. Yet no one thought to solve the problem by sleeping more. Life did not allow it. Instead, medieval society built rituals around exhaustion. Night prayers, charms, protective symbols carved above doors, all were meant to guard tired souls. People slept with amulets, knives, or religious symbols near their beds. Not because it helped them sleep, but because it helped them feel safe while half awake. And beneath all of this was fear of the unknown. Sleep deprivation kept people in a constant state of alertness. The line between the real world and the imagined world grew thin. In that thin space, stories became truth. As the hours dragged on, and the body cried for rest it would not receive, medieval people learned to live with exhaustion as a normal condition. But what they did not realize was how deeply it shaped their beliefs, turning night into a place of danger and wonder. When morning finally arrived in the medieval world, it did not bring relief. For the sleep-deprived, dawn was not a fresh beginning, but a continuation of exhaustion. The body rose because it had to, not because it was ready. Muscles ached from yesterday's labor, eyes burned from broken sleep, and the mind moved slowly, like it was wading through thick fog. Yet work did not wait. Fields needed tending, animals needed feeding, tools needed lifting. Medieval life offered no pause button for fatigue. People worked while tired because survival demanded it. Farmers stepped into their fields after nights broken by cold, noise, or fear. Plowing soil with heavy wooden tools required strength and coordination. But sleep deprivation dulled both. Hands slipped, steps faltered, tempers flared. A tired farmer could misjudge the depth of a furrow or the strength of an ox, turning simple work into danger. Injuries were common, yet rarely blamed on lack of sleep. Pain was expected. Exhaustion was normal. Complaining changed nothing. Craftsmen suffered in quieter, but equally dangerous ways. Blacksmiths worked with fire and iron, while their minds lagged behind their hands. One slow reaction could mean a burn or a crushed finger. Carpenters cut wood while their vision blurred, their focus drifting. A single mistake could ruin materials that took weeks to gather. Sleep deprivation made skilled work harder, yet deadlines did not soften. Orders from lords and towns had to be filled. Market days were especially brutal. Merchants often traveled through the night to reach trading centers by dawn. They arrived already exhausted, expected to bargain sharply, count coins accurately, and protect themselves from theft. A tired mind made poor decisions. Prices were misjudged. Deals went wrong. But trade was essential, and sleep was a luxury few could afford. For servants and laborers, sleep deprivation was constant and enforced. They rose before their masters, worked until late, and slept where they could. Long days and short nights crushed the body slowly. Many lived in a permanent state of tiredness, so deep they could no longer imagine what real rest felt like. Their exhaustion became invisible, simply part of who they were. Decision-making suffered quietly. Village elders met early, often after broken sleep, to settle disputes or plan work. Their judgments were shaped by fatigue, even if they did not realize it. Harsh punishments, poor planning, and impulsive choices were more likely when minds were worn thin. Sleep deprivation did not just affect individuals, it shaped communities. Children were not spared. They worked alongside adults, often after restless nights. Crying babies had kept households awake, yet children were still expected to carry water, herd animals, and learn trades. Tired children grew irritable and unfocused. Discipline was harsh. Adults believed tiredness was a sign of weakness, not a problem to solve. Even the wealthy were not immune. Lords attended councils, heard petitions, and managed lands while running on little sleep. Night feasts, political tension, and constant threat kept their rest shallow. A lord's poor decision could affect hundreds of lives. Wars were planned, alliances formed, and punishments ordered by men whose minds were dulled by exhaustion. Medical understanding offered no comfort. Medieval healers recognized fatigue, but did not understand sleep as essential healing. Remedies focused on food, herbs, or bloodletting. If someone seemed slow or confused, it was blamed on bad humors, sin, or divine will. Chronic sleep deprivation went unnamed, untreated, and unchallenged. Emotionally, tired people became harder, sharper, and sometimes crueler. Patience ran thin. Arguments started easily. Violence flared over small misunderstandings. In a world where law was uneven and justice often personal, a tired mind could mean a deadly outcome. Many conflicts likely began not with hatred, but with exhaustion. Yet, medieval people adapted. They learned to work while tired because they had no choice. Short rests against walls, moments of stillness by fires, brief pauses in the fields became survival tools. These small breaks were not called naps. They were simply moments to breathe. Life continued in a constant rhythm of effort and fatigue. As the sun climbed higher, sleep-deprived bodies pushed forward, carrying the weight of night into the day. And as work ended and darkness returned once more, exhaustion followed them home, waiting to repeat the cycle again. As night fell again over medieval towns and villages, exhaustion was no longer just an accident of life. In many cases, it was something deliberately used, encouraged, and even enforced. Sleep deprivation became a tool, shaped by religion, authority, and discipline. In a world where control over the body was seen as control over the soul, denying sleep was powerful. People were taught that rest could be dangerous, that too much sleep invited sin, weakness, and temptation. And so, staying awake became a strange kind of virtue. In monasteries and convents, exhaustion was part of devotion. Monks and nuns lived by strict schedules that fractured sleep night after night. Bells rang in the dark hours, calling them from thin mattresses and cold stone floors. They stumbled through corridors half awake, eyes burning, bodies aching. Yet they believed this suffering mattered. Sleep deprivation was not seen as harm. It was sacrifice. A tired body was thought to quiet sinful thoughts and make space for God. Many religious writings praised those who could endure wakefulness without complaint. But the human mind does not surrender easily. Sleep-deprived monks often reported visions during long prayers. Candlelight flickered, shadows danced on stone walls, and the boundary between thought and reality dissolved. Some saw holy figures. Others felt intense guilt, fear, or temptation. These experiences reinforced belief. Exhaustion made the spiritual world feel closer, more real, more urgent. Outside religious walls, authorities also understood the power of fatigue. Sleep deprivation was used as punishment, even if it was not always named as such. Prisoners were kept awake by noise, cold, or constant questioning. Guards knew that a tired person was easier to break, easier to confuse, easier to control. Confessions often came after long nights without rest. A weary mind struggled to resist pressure or think clearly. Public punishments added to this culture of exhaustion. Criminals were sometimes displayed overnight in cages or stocks, exposed to cold, mockery, and fear. Sleep was impossible. By morning, the punishment had already done its work. The broken posture, the slow movements, the empty eyes told the crowd everything. Lack of sleep humiliated as much as it harmed. Even in homes, control over sleep was common. Servants had little say over when they rested. They stayed up late and rose early at the command of their masters. Refusal was seen as laziness or rebellion. Sleep deprivation reinforced hierarchy. Those with power slept when they could. Those without power endured. Children were trained early to ignore fatigue. Crying at night was punished. Staying awake for chores or prayers was expected. Parents believed endurance built character. But in reality, it built exhaustion into the body from a young age. Tired children grew into tired adults, never questioning whether life could be different. Fear also played a role. Authorities encouraged the idea that night belonged to danger. Curfews were enforced. Being awake at the wrong time invited suspicion. Watchmen questioned anyone moving in darkness. At the same time, these same watchmen were denied rest themselves, pacing walls night after night, slowly wearing down. Sleep deprivation became woven into obedience. A tired population is quieter, slower to question, more likely to accept suffering as normal. Medieval rulers did not need to understand neuroscience to see the results. Exhausted people focused on survival, not rebellion. And yet, beneath this control, something restless stirred. Tired minds wandered. Doubts crept in during long nights. strange thoughts surfaced in the dark. Exhaustion weakened obedience as much as it strengthened it. People whispered complaints by firelight. Dreams mixed with waking thoughts. Faith wavered. Fear grew. As medieval nights stretched on, filled with enforced wakefulness and silent suffering, sleep deprivation became more than a condition. It became a system, and as we move forward, we will see how this system affected the mind itself, shaping memory, madness, and the thin line between sanity and collapse in a world that rarely slept. As sleep deprivation continued night after night, year after year, it began to leave deeper marks on the medieval mind. This was not the kind of tiredness that fades after a good rest. This was exhaustion that settled into the bones, into thought, into memory itself. People did not talk about mental health, but they lived with its quiet collapse every day. In a world where true rest was rare, the mind slowly changed shape. Memory was often the first thing to suffer. Sleep-deprived medieval people forgot names, faces, promises, and details. A farmer might forget which field had already been planted. A merchant might miscount coins. A servant might forget an order and be punished harshly for it. Forgetfulness was not seen as illness. It was seen as carelessness, stupidity, or sin. And so people learned to fear their own tired minds. Confusion became common. Long hours awake made thoughts wander and loop. People repeated themselves, misunderstood instructions, or struggled to follow simple conversations. In village courts, witnesses gave conflicting accounts not because they lied, but because exhaustion twisted memory. Truth became slippery when the mind was worn thin. Arguments dragged on, fueled by misunderstandings that sleep might have solved. Some suffered more deeply. Chronic sleep deprivation led to states that today might be called breakdowns. Medieval records describe people who spoke to themselves, laughed at nothing, or stared into space for long periods. These behaviors were often explained as possession, divine punishment, or moral failure. The idea that lack of sleep could damage the mind did not exist. Instead, the exhausted were feared. Hallucinations were not rare. Tired minds created sounds, shapes, and voices. People swore they saw figures at the edge of fields, heard their names whispered in empty rooms, or felt hands touch them in the dark. These experiences felt real because, to the exhausted brain, they were real. The line between imagination and reality dissolved quietly, night by night. Madness, as medieval people understood it, was often born in exhaustion. Someone who stayed awake too long became erratic, emotional, unpredictable. They might cry without reason, shout in anger, or sink into silence. Families struggled to care for them. Communities avoided them. Without understanding or treatment, these people drifted to the margins of society. Sleep deprivation also deepened despair. Long nights left too much time for dark thoughts. Guilt, regret, and fear grew louder in silence. Without rest, the mind had no shield. Some people believed they were cursed. Others believed God had abandoned them. Exhaustion made faith heavy instead of comforting. Prayers felt empty. Hope thinned. Violence often followed. A tired mind reacts faster with anger than reason. Medieval records are full of sudden fights, domestic violence, and impulsive crimes. A harsh word, a mistake, a misunderstanding could spark bloodshed. In a world without police forces or modern justice systems, these moments carried deadly consequences. Sleep deprivation also shaped storytelling. Folktales of mad kings, cursed villagers, and haunted forests echoed real experiences of exhaustion. These stories were warnings and explanations. They taught people what might happen if the mind wandered too far at night. But they also trapped people in fear, reinforcing the belief that strange thoughts meant danger. Women often suffered silently. Nighttime childbirth, infant care, and household duties left them deeply sleep-deprived. Post-birth exhaustion combined with blood loss, and pain created states of confusion and despair. Some women were accused of madness or witchcraft simply because exhaustion changed their behavior. Tiredness became suspicion. Even healers misunderstood the signs. When someone showed mental distress, treatments often made things worse. Bloodletting weakened already exhausted bodies. Herbal sedatives sometimes caused delirium. Forced prayer sessions kept people awake even longer. The cure became another layer of harm. Yet, not all effects were dark. Some sleep-deprived minds became deeply reflective. Long nights brought quiet thinking. Poets, mystics, and storytellers often worked in these hours. Exhaustion loosened thought, allowing ideas to flow freely. Visions became art. Dreams became meaning. In rare cases, tired minds created beauty from suffering. But this was the exception, not the rule. For most, sleep deprivation slowly eroded stability. Life became heavier. Joy faded faster. The world felt harsher than it already was, as the effects of long-term sleep deprivation became impossible to ignore. Medieval communities responded not with care, but with distance and fear. A tired mind that behaved strangely unsettled everyone around it. When someone forgot customs, spoke out of turn, or acted unpredictably, the village did not ask why. It asked what was wrong with them. Exhaustion was invisible, but its consequences were not, and society looked for explanations that fit its beliefs. People who showed signs of mental strain were slowly pushed aside. A man who talked to himself after too many nights guarding livestock. A woman who stared too long into the fire, answering questions too slowly. A laborer who snapped in anger after weeks of broken sleep. These were not seen as tired people. They were seen as unstable, dangerous, or touched by something unnatural. Sleep deprivation quietly became a social dividing line. Families tried first to manage these individuals in private. They prayed harder. They forced stricter routines. They demanded obedience and discipline, believing control could restore order. But this often made things worse. More rules meant less rest. More pressure meant deeper exhaustion. When behavior did not improve, families felt shame. And shame spread quickly in close communities. Villages were small. Everyone noticed change. Rumors formed before facts. Someone who wandered at night might be accused of secret sins. Someone who spoke of visions might be suspected of witchcraft. Sleep-deprived hallucinations, once shared in whispers, became evidence when repeated too often. The community began to watch these people more closely, waiting for proof that their fear was justified. Isolation followed. People avoided sitting near them at church. Children were warned to stay away. Conversations ended abruptly when they approached. This social rejection deepened exhaustion and despair. Humans need rest, but they also need belonging. Losing both pushed some people closer to collapse. For others, the response was confinement. Those considered unstable were locked away, tied down, or handed over to religious authorities. Monasteries sometimes housed the mentally distressed, believing prayer could cure them. But these places often demanded strict schedules and night rituals, further robbing residents of sleep. The cycle repeated itself in silence. Sleep deprivation also played a role in how justice was carried out. Accused individuals were questioned late into the night. They were denied rest until their stories fell apart. Contradictions caused by fatigue were taken as lies. Confessions extracted from exhausted minds were accepted as truth. Once spoken, they could not be taken back. Women were especially vulnerable. A tired woman who forgot duties or spoke too boldly challenged expectations. Exhaustion after childbirth or long household labor altered behavior, sometimes dramatically. These changes frightened communities. Labels followed quickly. Strange, unstable, dangerous. Sleep deprivation became part of the path that led some women toward accusation and punishment. Old age worsened everything. Elderly people slept poorly, waking often in pain or confusion. Their tired minds struggled to keep pace with daily life. When memory failed, suspicion grew. The elderly were respected in theory, but feared in practice when exhaustion blurred their minds. There were no systems to help people recover. No understanding that rest could heal. Instead, medieval society hardened around the exhausted, treating them as problems to manage or threats to remove. This response did not come from cruelty alone. It came from fear. Fear of what exhaustion revealed about the fragility of the human mind. And yet, even as communities pushed the sleep-deprived aside, they relied on them. Night watchmen, guards, servants, and caretakers were often the most exhausted of all. Society depended on tired people, while punishing them for showing the effects of that tiredness. This contradiction sat at the heart of medieval life. As nights passed and days blurred together, sleep deprivation continued its quiet work, shaping who belonged and who did not. And in the next part, we will follow exhaustion into moments of crisis, fires, wars, and disasters, where a single tired decision could change history forever. As exhaustion deepened across medieval society, its consequences became most visible during moments of crisis, when the cost of sleeplessness could no longer be ignored. Sleep deprivation did not just shape quiet village life or private suffering. It stepped forward during fires, invasions, famines, and accidents, silently guiding decisions that altered lives forever. In these moments, tired minds stood between order and disaster. Night watchmen were the first line of defense for towns and cities. Their job demanded constant alertness, yet their lives were built on broken sleep. They walked the walls in darkness, eyes heavy, ears strained, bodies aching from long hours standing still. The cold cut through wool and leather, numbing fingers and slowing reactions. Many nodded off without realizing it, waking suddenly in panic, unsure how much time had passed. A missed sound, a delayed alarm, a moment of confusion could mean death for an entire town. Fires were among the greatest dangers of medieval life. Homes were built from wood and straw. Flames spread quickly. Many fires began at night when exhaustion dulled caution. A candle left burning, a hearth not properly covered, a tired servant forgetting a simple task. Sleep deprivation turned small mistakes into disasters. When flames were finally noticed, people woke disoriented, struggling to understand what they were seeing. Precious minutes were lost as tired minds tried to make sense of chaos. In these moments, leadership mattered. But leaders were tired too. Town officials, guild masters, and guards were often awake late, dealing with disputes, planning defenses, or attending religious duties. When crisis struck, they acted through the fog of exhaustion. Orders were unclear. Panic spread. People moved in the wrong direction. History remembers fires and invasions, but rarely the sleepless nights that made them worse. War magnified everything. Soldiers were expected to march long distances, stand watch through the night, and fight at dawn. Sleep deprivation was constant. Commanders knew that tired soldiers were slower, but they also knew that rest was risky. Sleeping too deeply could mean surprise attack. Armies lived in a state of half-sleep, never fully resting, never fully awake. Battles were often decided by exhaustion. a unit that failed to respond quickly, a guard who missed movement in the dark, a commander who misjudged timing. Sleep deprivation blurred judgment and slowed reactions, turning strategy into guesswork. Many defeats likely began with nothing more dramatic than a man too tired to think clearly. Sieges were worse. Trapped inside walls or camped outside them, soldiers endured weeks or months of broken sleep. Hunger, cold, and fear piled onto exhaustion. Hallucinations became common. Men swore they heard voices calling them from the darkness. Others lost track of days entirely. Morale collapsed not just from hunger, but from the mind's need for rest. Disasters during plagues and famines followed the same pattern. Caregivers worked without rest, tending the sick through the night. Grief kept families awake. Bells rang constantly for the dead. Sleep deprivation weakened immune systems, making people more vulnerable to illness. Exhaustion spread alongside disease, amplifying suffering. Midwives and healers faced endless nights. Childbirth rarely waited for daylight. Women labored through the dark, surrounded by exhausted helpers. Mistakes were made. Tools were dropped. Decisions were rushed. When outcomes were bad, blame fell quickly. Fatigue was never mentioned. Someone had to be at fault. During famine, sleep became even harder. Hunger made rest shallow and restless. People woke frequently, stomachs burning, minds racing. Theft increased at night. Guards stayed awake longer. Violence rose. Exhaustion fed desperation, and desperation fed exhaustion. It was a closed circle with no escape. Even celebrations carried risk. Festivals often ran late into the night. Drinking, dancing, and crowds kept people awake far beyond their limits. The next day, accidents followed. Fights broke out. Injuries increased. Joy had a cost, paid in fatigue. Sleep deprivation also shaped how people remembered these crises. Memories formed while exhausted were distorted. Stories grew darker, more dramatic. Fear lingered longer. Trauma settled deeper. Generations passed down tales of disaster, unaware that exhaustion had sharpened their edges. And still, medieval society never questioned the structure that produced this fatigue. Rest was something you took only when allowed. Sleep was something you earned, not something you needed. Those who collapsed were weak. Those who endured were praised, even as they slowly broke. As nights stretched on and crises came and went, sleep deprivation became part of history's shadow. It stood behind disasters, whispered through bad decisions, and walked quietly beside every tired soul. Faced with a lifetime of broken rest, medieval people did not try to eliminate exhaustion. Instead, they learned to live inside it. Over generations, customs formed around sleep deprivation, not to cure it, but to soften its edge. These habits became so normal that few questioned them. Sleep was no longer something private or sacred. It was something managed, negotiated, and shared with the night. Beds were rarely used the way we imagine today. Many people slept on straw pallets or wooden frames, often shared with family members or even animals. This closeness brought warmth, but it also brought noise, movement, and constant disturbance. Someone was always shifting, coughing, or waking. True deep sleep was rare, and so people accepted lighter, shorter rest as the natural state of the body. One of the most common coping methods was segmented sleep. People slept early, woke in the middle of the night, then slept again before dawn. This waking period was not considered a problem. It was expected. During these quiet hours, people prayed, talked softly, or simply lay still, waiting for sleep to return. This rhythm allowed the body to survive on less rest without collapsing entirely. Night prayers became anchors in exhaustion. Repeating familiar words calmed the mind. For some, prayer filled the gap where sleep failed. It gave purpose to wakefulness. Instead of fighting fatigue, people used it to feel closer to something larger than themselves. Even those who were not deeply religious followed these habits because they brought structure to long nights. Storytelling was another survival tool. Families shared tales in low voices during evening hours, helping minds relax before sleep. These stories often blended reality and imagination, reflecting the half-dream state of tired listeners. Folktales grew longer, darker, and more symbolic in these moments, shaped by exhaustion and dim firelight. People also learned to nap without naming it. A shepherd leaning against a tree, a merchant resting in a cart, a servant sitting quietly near the hearth. These moments of stillness were not planned, but they were essential. They allowed the body to recover just enough to continue. Food played a role. Heavy meals at night made sleep easier, even if it was shallow. Warm drinks calmed the body. Herbs like valerian or chamomile were used when available, though their effects were unpredictable. Sometimes they helped. Sometimes they worsened confusion. Still, people tried anything that promised rest. Dreams were respected, even welcomed. Because sleep was scarce, dreams felt precious. People discussed them openly, searching for meaning. A dream after exhaustion carried weight. It was seen as a message, a warning, or a sign. This belief gave purpose to restless nights, turning fatigue into something meaningful. Communal living also softened exhaustion. People shared night duties. Someone watched the fire while others slept. Someone stayed awake with the sick while others rested. This sharing did not eliminate fatigue, but it spread it, making it survivable. Yet these coping methods came with cost. Normalizing exhaustion meant accepting its damage. People grew used to pain, irritability, and confusion. They laughed it off. They blamed themselves. They never imagined life could feel clearer, lighter, or calmer. Still, within this tired world, moments of peace existed. A quiet night with no alarms, a deep sleep after harvest, a shared silence by the fire. These moments were rare, but they were cherished. In the medieval world, time did not move the way it does for us now. There were no glowing numbers on walls, no alarms slicing through dreams, no minutes counted with precision. Time was felt, not measured, and sleep deprivation played a powerful role in shaping that feeling. When rest came in fragments and nights stretched endlessly, the sense of time itself began to bend. For sleep-deprived medieval people, the night was not a single block of darkness. It was a landscape with phases, textures, and moods. Early night felt safe, familiar, close to the warmth of the hearth. Deep night felt dangerous, silent, and heavy. Pre-dawn hours carried a strange tension. When the world seemed to hold its breath, exhaustion sharpened these sensations. A tired mind experienced time slowly, painfully, as if each hour dragged its feet. Without clocks, people relied on sound to mark time. Church bells were the most powerful signals. They divided the day and night into moments of obligation. For monks, bells shattered sleep again and again. For villagers, they were reminders that rest was never fully their own. When bells rang in the night, the exhausted body obeyed, even if the mind resisted. Time belonged to authority, not to the sleeper. Light was another guide. The movement of the moon, the stars, the faint glow before dawn, all became reference points. Sleep-deprived people watched the sky closely. They learned to recognize how tired they were by how the night looked. A full moon could feel endless, exposing everything. A cloudy night felt shorter, heavier, more disorienting. Exhaustion made these details feel important, almost personal. Because sleep was broken, days blurred together. Memories struggled to separate one day from the next. A tired farmer might not remember if something happened yesterday or the day before. Life became a repeating cycle of effort and fatigue. This repetition shaped medieval thinking. Time felt circular, not linear. What had happened before would happen again. Change felt slow, almost impossible. This shaped religion deeply. Eternal cycles made sense to exhausted minds. Sin, repentance, suffering, redemption, all fit into a rhythm that mirrored broken sleep. Endurance became a moral value. If time itself felt endless, then suffering within it felt meaningful. Sleep deprivation quietly supported these beliefs, making hardship feel permanent and unavoidable. Travel distorted time even more. Journeys were long and exhausting. Travelers often moved at night to avoid heat or danger, sacrificing sleep to make progress. A few nights on the road could erase any sense of normal rhythm. Fatigue made distances feel longer, dangers feel closer, and decisions feel heavier. Many travelers described nights that felt like they would never end. For guards, sailors, and shepherds, time dissolved almost completely. Long watches under dark skies stretched endlessly, with nothing to do but stay awake. Minutes felt like hours. The body ached. Thoughts drifted. Exhaustion turned time into something to survive rather than something to use. Children learned this warped sense of time early. They watched adults rise in darkness, work while tired, and collapse briefly before starting again. Childhood did not feel light or carefree. It felt slow and demanding. Days dragged. Nights lingered. Sleep deprivation shaped their understanding of what life was supposed to feel like. Even joy was shaped by exhaustion. Festivals felt intense and unreal because they broke the routine. Staying awake late for celebration made time feel suspended. Laughter felt sharper. Music felt louder. The next day, fatigue returned with force, restoring the familiar rhythm. Pleasure was temporary. Exhaustion was constant. In this world, people did not ask how long something would take in hours or minutes. They asked how many nights it would cost, how many times they would wake, how much tiredness they would carry afterward. Time was measured in fatigue. As sleep deprivation bent time, it also bent patience. People expected delays, repetition, and waiting. A slow world matched their slow minds. Urgency existed only in moments of crisis. Everything else unfolded at the pace exhaustion allowed. And as medieval people lived inside this stretched, weary sense of time, they came to accept it as natural. They did not imagine a life with clear mornings and rested minds. They imagined endurance. And in the next part, we will see how this endurance shaped morality itself, how tired people judged right and wrong, strength and weakness, in a world where rest was rare and exhaustion was normal. In a world shaped by exhaustion, morality itself began to bend. Medieval people judged right and wrong through tired eyes, and those judgments carried the weight of sleepless nights. When rest is rare, endurance becomes virtue, and suffering becomes proof of worth. Sleep deprivation quietly rewrote the moral code, turning pain into discipline and fatigue into honor. Hard work was praised above all else. A person who rose early and worked late, no matter how tired, was seen as righteous. Someone who slept longer than others was suspected of laziness, sin, or weakness. Rest was not neutral. It was dangerous. Too much sleep was believed to invite temptation, dull the spirit, and weaken resolve. Exhaustion, on the other hand, showed commitment to God, to family, to duty. Religious teaching reinforced this belief. Saints were remembered not for comfort, but for endurance. Stories praised those who slept on stone floors, fasted through hunger, and prayed through the night. Their exhaustion was not a flaw. It was evidence of holiness. Ordinary people tried to imitate this in smaller ways, pushing themselves past their limits because suffering felt meaningful. This shaped how people judged each other. A tired worker earned respect. A person who complained about fatigue did not. Sympathy was limited. Everyone was exhausted, so why should one person be treated differently? This mindset hardened communities. Compassion thinned. People learned to hide their weariness, to push through pain silently. Sleep deprivation also shaped justice. Punishments were designed to exhaust. Long public humiliations, overnight confinement, forced labor at dawn, all aimed to break the body and spirit. Mercy was rare because endurance was expected. If someone collapsed, it confirmed their weakness. The system did not see cruelty. It saw correction. Even kindness was filtered through fatigue. Helping someone often meant sacrificing rest, staying awake with the sick, guarding a neighbor's property, watching children overnight. These acts were praised because they cost sleep. Generosity was measured by how much exhaustion one was willing to endure for others. This moral system also shaped guilt. When people felt tired, irritable, or confused, they blamed themselves. Exhaustion felt like moral failure. If the mind wandered during prayer, it was sin. If anger rose quickly, it was weakness. Sleep deprivation made self-judgment harsher. People punished themselves mentally for reactions their bodies could not control. Women carried a special burden. Endurance was expected of them without recognition. Nighttime labor, childcare, and household duties were invisible but constant. Their exhaustion was assumed, not praised. When they faltered, morality turned against them quickly. A tired woman was judged more harshly than a tired man. Fatigue became suspicion. Children absorbed these lessons early. They learned that rest was something to feel guilty about. Staying awake for chores or prayers was praised. Falling asleep was punished. This shaped generations who equated worth with endurance, never questioning the cost. Yet beneath this moral structure, cracks appeared. Some people quietly resisted. They stole moments of rest. They lingered in bed after dawn. They pretended to pray while closing their eyes. These small acts were not rebellion. They were survival. Exhaustion pushed people to bend rules in silence. Over time, this constant pressure shaped character. Medieval people were often described as stoic, patient, and enduring. But this was not just culture. It was fatigue. When the body is always tired, emotions flatten. Hope becomes cautious. Dreams shrink to fit survival. And still, life went on. People loved, laughed, and believed, even while exhausted. They carried their moral code through sleepless nights, unaware that it had been shaped by the very thing draining them. By the late medieval period, subtle changes were beginning to ripple through society, and even the rhythms of sleep were not immune. Towns grew larger, trade became more complex, and new technologies demanded longer hours, but also offered glimpses of efficiency. Yet, for the exhausted masses, these changes were double-edged. Sleep deprivation remained omnipresent, but the way people experienced it began to shift in ways that would quietly transform daily life, belief, and the very texture of existence. In bustling market towns, merchants extended their hours to keep up with trade networks that reached far beyond their villages. Exhausted men and women rose before dawn, traveled long distances, carried heavy goods, and negotiated deals through haze-thickened mines. Fatigue was their companion, and it shaped every decision. Coins were miscounted, goods spoiled from misjudged storage, and agreements fell apart due to forgotten details. Yet merchants persisted, not because sleep was optional, but because it was impossible. There was no pause button in commerce. Survival demanded constant motion, and exhaustion quietly dictated who would thrive and who would falter. In castles and courts, lords and ladies faced similar burdens, though clothed in wealth and ceremony. Banquets ran late, councils stretched into the night, and correspondence traveled slowly across kingdoms, forcing sleepless attention. Noble advisors often made critical decisions while running on fragmented rest, their minds oscillating between clarity and haze. A military order issued in the dead of night, a tax levied after endless review, or a judgment passed in the small hours could all ripple outward, affecting hundreds, even thousands of lives. Exhaustion was not an abstract condition. It was power, danger, and risk all at once. Meanwhile, laborers, servants, and peasants bore the most relentless toll. Fields still needed plowing, livestock still needed care, and fires still needed tending. Those who slept poorly during the night were expected to continue working, to rise before the sun, and to endure both labor and authority without complaint. Communities built their lives on the reliability of the exhausted. Misjudgments born from fatigue were often interpreted as personal failings rather than physical limitations. A tired farmer who mismeasured a seed sack, a weary craftsman whose hammer slipped, a half-asleep servant who mismanaged a lord's household. All were quietly punished, corrected, or mocked. Exhaustion had become woven into the social fabric, invisible yet unavoidable. Even the structure of cities reinforced this. Streets were narrow and dark, filled with noise from nightly activity, carts creaking, dogs barking, and watchmen pacing. Sleep could never be entirely private. Homes shared walls. Neighbors moved and spoke through the thin night air. In some cases, families slept in shifts, a method designed to keep at least one person awake to guard property, tend fires, or watch for marauders. Rest became a system, managed with practicality rather than comfort, and the line between necessity and torment blurred. Religion continued to exert its influence on the weary. Monastic schedules became more rigid, and devotional practices emphasized endurance. Night vigils, candlelit prayers, and strict fasting were presented as ways to cultivate holiness. Yet, they also perpetuated sleeplessness. Tired monks and nuns walked long corridors, repeated prayers mechanically, and listened to echoes of their own exhaustion. Their visions, sometimes divine, sometimes hallucinatory, were taken as signs of spiritual insight. Sleep deprivation elevated the mundane to the sacred, making fatigue not just a physical condition, but a conduit for belief. Yet, as society edged toward the Renaissance, new ideas began to challenge the old rhythms. Medical texts slowly began to recognize that rest had value, even if understanding was limited. Scholars debated the influence of sleep on memory, mood, and health. Some doctors suggested specific hours for rest, prescribed herbal remedies, or encouraged brief naps. These ideas were not yet widespread, but they represented the first faint acknowledgement that exhaustion was more than a moral test. It was a physical and mental hazard. Interestingly, exhaustion also fueled innovation in small ways. Sleepless minds, awake during quiet nights, observed patterns, experimented with techniques, and recorded thoughts. Poets composed verses in the hours when sleep refused them. Artisans sketched ideas while tending late fires. Some discoveries, some observations of the natural world, likely arose from this strange liminal space between wakefulness and dream. Fatigue sharpened perception in certain ways, even as it dulled others, creating a paradoxical blend of clarity and confusion that shaped medieval life. Families adapted too, in ways that seem strange to modern eyes. Shared sleeping arrangements, rotating night duties, segmented sleep, and even planned vigilance became traditions that persisted for centuries. Parents taught children the endurance necessary to survive in a sleepless world, reinforcing the notion that fatigue was natural, unavoidable, and morally significant. To sleep deeply and uninterrupted was almost a luxury of the few, and even then, it was fragile. Through all of this, fear remained a constant companion. Sleep-deprived minds were fertile ground for superstition, and crises magnified this. Night raids, fires, plagues, and wars seemed more terrifying when experienced through exhausted perception. Misjudgments became tragedies, hallucinations became warnings, and dreams became omens. Communities constructed rituals, charms, and prayers not to restore sleep, but to manage its consequences, to ward off harm, and to give meaning to sleepless nights. And yet, despite the physical strain, the moral weight, and the constant threat of danger, medieval people persevered. Sleep deprivation shaped them in silence, altering their perception, decisions, and relationships. It wove itself into the rhythms of daily life, became a measure of virtue, a tool of control, and a canvas for imagination. Exhaustion was not just a part of medieval life, it was its invisible architect, quietly molding everything from labor to law, from superstition to art, from fear to devotion. As centuries passed and society slowly evolved, the patterns forged by sleepless nights did not vanish entirely. The lessons of endurance, the rituals of night, and the moral weight of fatigue lingered, echoing in ways that would influence future generations. Medieval people may not have understood the science of sleep, but they understood its power, its ability to shape thought, behavior, and community in ways both terrifying and transformative. Even as medieval life pushed people into cycles of exhaustion, sleep deprivation began to influence not just the individual, but the collective consciousness of entire communities. In towns and villages, fatigue became a shared experience, a silent rhythm that bound people together, even as it isolated them. Everyone understood its cost, yet few spoke of it openly. It was a condition that shaped thoughts, speech, and behavior so profoundly that the entire society operated as if moving through a dreamlike haze, half awake and half alert. Nighttime was the crucible where this shared fatigue became most apparent. Streets emptied quickly as the last candle flickered out in homes, yet the darkness was not complete silence. Dogs barked, cats prowled, and the occasional traveler's footsteps echoed between walls. Those who remained awake, watchmen, late returning laborers, or individuals recovering from illness, experienced a world simultaneously familiar and alien. Shadows stretched unnaturally. Familiar shapes seemed to move, and ordinary sounds became eerie and threatening. Sleep-deprived minds interpreted the night as a living entity, a presence that observed, judged, and sometimes punished. Fear intertwined with exhaustion, and imagination became an indistinguishable part of perception. Religious and superstitious beliefs amplified this distorted perception. The tired mind was fertile ground for visions, omens, and premonitions. Monks reported seeing angels or demons in the flicker of candlelight during prolonged vigils, while peasants whispered of spirits wandering fields and forests when they labored into the night. Exhaustion made the extraordinary feel real. Dreams, hallucinations, and half-awake imaginings were treated as meaningful events, evidence of divine favor or malevolent influence. The line between reality and imagination was blurred, and people adapted by layering ritual, prayer, and superstition onto every sleepless hour. Exhaustion also reshaped social hierarchies. Those who could endure long nights without complaint gained authority and respect. A craftsman who toiled tirelessly, a soldier who kept watch without faltering, or a servant who remained alert through endless chores, was seen as morally and physically superior. Conversely, those who succumbed to fatigue collapsed during work, lost focus, or complained were viewed as weak, sinful, or deficient. Sleep deprivation became a measure not just of health, but of character. Societies judged endurance as a moral imperative, and the tired body became a canvas on which virtue and vice were written. At the same time, this exhaustion created fragility in social structures. Fatigued individuals were more susceptible to errors, misunderstandings, and impulsive decisions. A tired guard could fail to spot intruders. A weary messenger might deliver information incorrectly. A sleep-deprived laborer might mismanage critical supplies. Missteps born from fatigue had consequences far beyond the individual, sometimes sparking conflicts, economic losses, or accidents. Society functioned in a delicate balance, relying on the constant alertness of people who were rarely fully awake. Sleep deprivation also left its mark on memory and storytelling. Long hours awake, combined with fragmented rest, distorted recollections. Events were remembered with exaggeration or omission. Fear, wonder, and fatigue shaped narratives more than factual accuracy. Stories told around fires or in the dim light of a home became elaborate and symbolic, embedding exhaustion into the very fabric of culture. Folktales, legends, and moral lessons were infused with the rhythm of sleeplessness, reflecting the blurry line between wakefulness and dreaming that medieval people experienced every night. Even physical labor carried an added psychological weight. Fields, mills, and workshops demanded constant attention, and exhaustion slowed reaction time while heightening irritability. Arguments were common among families and coworkers, fueled by fatigue and frustration. Minor mistakes could escalate quickly because tired minds misinterpreted intentions, forgot instructions, or lost patience. Sleep deprivation acted as both a hidden enemy and a social regulator, shaping interpersonal dynamics in ways that were subtle, pervasive, and enduring. Healthcare, too, reflected the influence of exhaustion. Medieval healers worked long hours, tending to the sick and injured with minimal rest. Their fatigue reduced effectiveness and sometimes created harm, yet their dedication was celebrated. Remedies were applied inconsistently. Judgments about illness were colored by personal tiredness, and mistakes were often excused or rationalized. The medical knowledge of the time was incomplete, and sleep deprivation ensured that even those attempting to heal were limited by their own exhausted perceptions. And still, people adapted. Tiny rituals and coping mechanisms emerged to make sleeplessness tolerable. Short naps in the fields, brief rests by fires, and communal support helped distribute the burden of fatigue. Storytelling, prayer, and song offered relief for minds stretched thin. These adaptations allowed society to survive the relentless demands of a world that offered little reprieve. Yet, they also normalized exhaustion, embedding it so deeply into daily life that most could not imagine life otherwise. As the centuries passed, sleep deprivation continued to shape behavior, culture, and social norms. It dictated who could lead, who could follow, and who could survive. And yet, even as endurance was celebrated, exhaustion whispered its cost. Distorted perception, fragile memories, and restless minds. In the next part, we will explore the personal lives of medieval people, the intimate struggles, secret coping strategies, and private moments where the relentless grip of sleeplessness collided with love, family, and desire. The personal lives of medieval people, shaped by exhaustion, were a delicate dance between necessity and desire, between duty and fleeting pleasure. Fatigue infiltrated every intimate moment, from family interactions to private reflections, leaving its mark on relationships, emotions, and even love itself, in a world where work, survival, and vigilance dominated the hours. Sleep deprivation was never just physical, it seeped into the very essence of daily existence. Households were centers of relentless activity, and rest was a luxury few could afford. Parents struggled to balance the needs of their children, the demands of labor, and the expectations of their communities. Mothers, in particular, bore the weight of constant fatigue. Nighttime feedings, the care of infants, and the unceasing rhythm of household chores left them walking through days in a haze. Fathers, while often engaged in heavier labor or long travel for trade, were not immune. Their nights could be spent guarding property, tending livestock, or completing unfinished work. Together, they navigated a life where exhaustion dictated their choices, from what they ate to how they interacted. Love and intimacy were profoundly affected. Sleep deprivation dulled desire, altered moods, and heightened irritability. Couples struggled to maintain connection when their bodies and minds were stretched thin. Yet, fatigue also created pockets of intensity. A stolen moment of closeness during a quiet night, when the rest of the household was asleep, felt amplified. The haze of exhaustion sometimes heightened emotions, making fleeting gestures, whispers, and glances feel more vivid, more urgent. Long nights awake together could foster unexpected bonds, even as they strained the body and mind. Children were acutely aware of the rhythms of fatigue. They learned early to adapt to exhaustion, observing adults who moved slowly, argued sharply, or forgot easily. Play was interwoven with short bursts of rest, and learning often happened in fits and starts, dictated by the rhythms of alertness and sleepiness. Stories told at dusk carried an extra weight for young minds, as the thin line between imagination and hallucination was easier to cross in half-sleep. Dreams, anxieties, and warnings merged, shaping personality and understanding of the world. Exhaustion became part of the moral and emotional education of the young. Even the very experience of pleasure was altered. Feasts, festivals, and celebrations were heightened by sleep deprivation. Music seemed more powerful, flavors sharper, and communal joy more intense. Yet these moments were ephemeral. As quickly as excitement surged, fatigue returned, pulling the mind into lethargy or irritability. The transient nature of pleasure was magnified by the constant presence of exhaustion, teaching a subtle lesson. Joy was fleeting, endurance was permanent. Secrets and personal reflection often thrived in the small hours of the night. Those awake, while the rest of the household slept, found time for introspection, prayer, or private thoughts. Fatigue blurred judgment, but deepened contemplation. Ideas formed in a mixture of clarity and dreamlike distortion, sometimes leading to insight, sometimes to confusion. The mind, half awake, wandered freely, exploring fears, ambitions, and desires that daylight hours left unexamined. These private moments became sanctuaries, places where exhaustion paradoxically allowed freedom, even as it sapped energy. Yet, exhaustion also carried risks for personal safety and social reputation. Mistakes made in fatigue could ignite conflicts, damage relationships, or invite gossip. A word spoken sharply, a forgotten errand, a misjudged gesture, each could have consequences far beyond the immediate moment. Sleep deprivation made people unpredictable, creating tension in households and communities alike. Trust had to be measured against the reality of tired minds. Even those closest to each other learned to navigate this instability carefully. Illness magnified the effects of sleep deprivation. A sick person, already weak from disease, found exhaustion relentless. Caregivers, themselves tired, struggled to provide proper attention. Mistakes became common. Fatigue amplified worry, guilt, and fear, making every moment more intense and every decision weightier. The personal sphere, already constrained by work and necessity, became a space of heightened vulnerability and quiet heroism. Despite the relentless strain, people found ways to weave intimacy, care, and personal expression into their lives. Small gestures, a shared meal, a whispered word, a gentle touch were magnified by the exhaustion surrounding them. Sleep-deprived hearts and minds may have been frayed, but they were also deeply attentive to fleeting moments of connection. This duality, fragile yet intense, defined the human experience in a sleepless world. As exhaustion shaped personal lives, it continued to influence culture, art, and expression. Stories, songs, and visual depictions of love, loss, and endurance were tinged with the haze of fatigue. Emotions were sharper, experiences more intense, and life itself felt both longer and shorter, as days blurred into nights and nights into a restless continuum. And as we move forward, we will explore how these private struggles, these intimate experiences of sleep deprivation, intersected with broader societal events, crises, discoveries, and transformations that tested the limits of human endurance and reshaped the world in ways both subtle and profound. Sleep deprivation in medieval times did not exist in isolation. It was intertwined with the broader rhythms of life, influencing not just individuals and households, but entire communities, economies, and societies. Exhaustion shaped decisions in ways that were subtle yet profound, guiding the course of daily life and even altering the outcomes of crises that history would later record. The patterns of fatigue touched every profession, every social class, and every corner of the known world, quietly dictating what was possible and what was not. Consider the laboring classes first, for whom exhaustion was both constant and brutal. Fields needed tending from dawn until dusk, and often before the sun had fully risen. Harvest seasons brought relentless toil, with workers waking in darkness to plow, sow, or reap. Many relied on short, fragmented sleep in barns, under trees, or on straw-filled floors, never fully recovering before the next day's labor. When storms destroyed crops or floods struck the fields, sleep-deprived farmers reacted more slowly. Mistakes multiplied, tools were mishandled, livestock were neglected, and minor injuries became debilitating. Exhaustion blurred perception, slowed reaction, and sharpened anxiety, making every disaster more dangerous. Yet the expectation to continue working without complaint persisted, cementing fatigue as a measure of responsibility, endurance, and worth. In towns and cities, the effects of sleep deprivation were equally pervasive, but manifested differently. Merchants, artisans, and craftsmen often worked late into the night to fulfill contracts, meet deadlines, or maintain trade networks. Candlelight illuminated long hours of counting, crafting, and negotiation, but it could not restore energy. A tired craftsman might mismeasure wood. A merchant might miscalculate profit, or an apprentice might misplace precious materials. These errors were rarely attributed to fatigue. Instead, they were seen as carelessness, negligence, or lack of skill. Exhaustion shaped both productivity and reputation, and those who endured the longest were respected, even as their bodies and minds deteriorated. Military life amplified the dangers of sleeplessness. Soldiers, guards, and knights were expected to maintain vigilance through the night, to march at dawn, and to fight at peak performance despite chronic fatigue. Sleep-deprived men moved more slowly, reacted more hesitantly, and misjudged the positions of friend and foe. In some cases, fatigue determined the outcome of battles, sieges, and campaigns. A single tired decision, a delayed signal, a misread order, or a moment of lapse in alertness could cost lives, shift the balance of power, or change the trajectory of history. Exhaustion became a silent general on the battlefield, invisible yet omnipresent, influencing outcomes without ceremony or recognition. Religious institutions were no less affected. Monks, nuns, and clerics adhered to schedules of prayer that cut deeply into nightly rest. Vigils, matins, and midnight prayers demanded attention, discipline, and obedience, often forcing practitioners to function on little more than a few hours of broken sleep, their minds, hovering between wakefulness and trance, were more susceptible to visions, hallucinations, and intense emotion. While these experiences were often interpreted as divine insight or spiritual awakening, they were also byproducts of sleep deprivation, blurring the line between sacred experience and the physiological effects of exhaustion. Fires, plagues, and natural disasters illuminated the societal cost of fatigue. When a fire broke out in a town at midnight, the initial response depended on those awake to react. Sleep-deprived watchmen might miss the first signs. Tired villagers could hesitate or miscommunicate warnings. Plague outbreaks saw caregivers, already running on minimal rest, become overwhelmed, mistakes multiplying as exhaustion impaired judgment. Decisions made in the haze of fatigue shaped survival rates, influenced the spread of disease, and determined the intensity of panic and social breakdown. Sleep deprivation was an unseen force directing human behavior, subtly dictating life or death in crises. Exhaustion also impacted learning, memory, and knowledge transfer. Scribes copying texts, apprentices learning trades, and scholars studying manuscripts all faced long hours under poor lighting and physical strain. Mistakes were inevitable. Letters miswritten, calculations miscounted, recipes or remedies incorrectly recorded. Yet these errors were absorbed into the cultural and intellectual record, altering how knowledge was preserved, transmitted, and interpreted. Sleep deprivation was a filter through which information passed, shaping the very way the world was understood for generations. Even the arts bore the imprint of fatigue. Painters, poets, and musicians often worked through nights of labor and reflection, their exhaustion coloring their creations. Shadows in paintings, the pacing of narrative in stories, and the tonal shifts in music often mirrored the rhythm of weariness. The long hours awake, the quiet reflection in candlelit rooms, and the fragmented rest shaped aesthetic choices. In subtle ways, fatigue itself became a medium, transforming ordinary creativity into something reflective of the human experience of exhaustion. Yet perhaps the most insidious effect of sleep deprivation was psychological. Chronic fatigue warped perception, heightened fear, and altered decision-making. People who were constantly tired were more prone to anxiety, suspicion, and impulsive action, communities became more conservative, cautious, and ritualistic, relying on repeated patterns, superstition, and rigid social norms to maintain order. Exhaustion reinforced hierarchy, obedience, and fear of deviation, shaping both social behavior and cultural values. It became invisible infrastructure, a force that structured society from the inside out, molding morality, labor, art, and thought. And through all of this, medieval people carried on, unaware of the unseen force shaping their lives. They developed rituals, beliefs, and coping strategies, but exhaustion remained relentless. Nights passed with fragmented rest, days blurred into fatigue, and centuries of human experience were quietly molded by the invisible hand of sleeplessness. As we move into the next part, we will explore how these patterns of exhaustion intersected with moments of innovation, adaptation, and survival. How sleepless minds sometimes gave rise to remarkable resilience, ingenuity, and unexpected brilliance in a world dominated by fatigue. Amid the relentless weight of fatigue, medieval people occasionally discovered pockets of resilience, ingenuity, and even brilliance. Sleep deprivation shaped not just labor and morality, but also adaptation, forcing communities and individuals to innovate in ways both subtle and profound. While exhaustion often constrained the body and dulled the mind, it also cultivated a kind of resourcefulness, a survival instinct honed by necessity. People learned to stretch the limits of wakefulness, to extract productivity from half-slumbered hours, and to navigate a world where every decision carried the added burden of fatigue. In households, innovation took practical forms. Families devised sleeping arrangements to maximize rest for the greatest number. Rotating watches, where one family member stayed awake while others slept, became standard in wealthier homes, ensuring both safety and continuity of care. In rural cottages, people napped in shifts, leaned against walls, or rested in corners while supervising children or tending fires. These improvisations required awareness, observation, and coordination, a complex dance of endurance and social intelligence. Sleep deprivation was not merely endured. It was managed, turned into a skill that allowed people to survive long, difficult nights while continuing essential labor. Craftsmen and artisans also adapted. Candlelight was precious and dangerous, so people learned to work efficiently in dim conditions, developing a patience and attention to detail that balanced fatigue with necessity. Scribes, copying manuscripts for monasteries or noble patrons, often rested their eyes for brief intervals, trained their hands to continue steady work despite haze-heavy minds, and developed techniques to catch errors before they compounded. Mistakes were inevitable, but over time, these individuals honed systems of self-correction, creating methods of work relied on endurance as much as skill. Their ability to function while exhausted shaped the transmission of knowledge, influencing literature, law, and religious texts for generations. Agricultural societies, too, found ways to turn exhaustion into strategic advantage. Farmers learned the rhythms of segmented sleep and used dawn or dusk hours for critical tasks. Aligning labor with natural light and seasonal cycles, they discovered that brief rests, strategically timed, could restore alertness enough to prevent errors during critical moments of planting, harvesting, or livestock care. Exhaustion, paradoxically, became a teacher, revealing patterns in nature, behavior, and time that rested individuals might overlook. A half-awake mind noticed the subtle shift of seasons, the distant approach of storms, or the faint signs of disease in animals, details easily missed by those well-rested and complacent. Sleep deprivation even influenced creativity in unexpected ways. Monks, scholars, and poets working through long nights often experienced altered states of mind, blending dreamlike imagery with waking reflection. The haze of fatigue sometimes unlocked intuitive leaps, connecting disparate ideas, imagining possibilities, or composing works that resonated with emotional depth. Songs, stories, and prayers from these exhausted minds carried a unique cadence, shaped by the rhythm of sleeplessness, the repetition of prayers, and the flickering light of candles. What emerged was a culture of creation intertwined with exhaustion, a testament to human adaptability under relentless strain. Yet survival was not merely intellectual or creative. Communities devised structural adaptations to endure collective fatigue. Watchtowers, night guards, and organized patrols allowed some rest for the majority while ensuring security. Guilds regulated workloads to balance efficiency with endurance, recognizing that overworked hands and weary minds could not sustain productivity indefinitely. Even early medical practices, though rudimentary, incorporated the observation that rest, or the strategic lack of it, altered outcomes. Remedies were timed for night or day based on energy levels. Care for the sick included shifts for attendance, and herbal treatments were sometimes applied to enhance alertness or calm restless bodies. Sleep deprivation was thus woven into the very infrastructure of daily life, both a challenge and a tool for survival. Despite these adaptive strategies, the cost remained high. Chronic fatigue eroded health, dulled perception, and intensified emotional stress. Exhaustion compounded grief, heightened fear, and magnified the consequences of errors. Even those most adept at managing sleeplessness were vulnerable to collapse, accident, or illness. Yet this vulnerability was a constant companion, shaping judgment, behavior, and community norms. People learned to anticipate it, to respect it, and sometimes to exploit it in subtle ways. negotiating with fatigue as they would with any other natural force. Remarkably, this endurance and adaptation created a culture of shared experience. Sleep-deprived communities developed an unspoken understanding of each other's limits. Compassion, patience, and collaboration were often measured by awareness of fatigue. Neighbors helped carry burdens, shared watches, and offered brief respites to those on the edge of collapse. These acts of solidarity were small but vital, allowing society to function despite the relentless demands of life and the unyielding presence of exhaustion. And yet, even in adaptation, medieval people never fully mastered sleep. It remained elusive, fragmented, and precious. Every solution, every innovation, every coping strategy was a temporary reprieve, a small negotiation with a force that could never be fully conquered. Fatigue dictated the boundaries of action, imagination, and endurance, shaping both ordinary life and extraordinary events alike. As we move into the final part of this story, we will witness the ultimate consequences of living under the unrelenting pressure of sleeplessness. How exhaustion influenced legacy, memory, and the very way medieval people were remembered, leaving traces that extend far beyond the fragile, tired bodies that endured it. In the final hours of our journey through the medieval world, the full impact of sleep deprivation comes into focus. It was a force as silent as it was pervasive, shaping not just the lives of individuals, but the trajectory of communities, cities, and entire societies. The exhausted medieval person left an imprint on history, both visible and invisible, in ways that modern observers might not immediately recognize. Sleep, or the lack of it, became a hidden architect of culture, innovation, morality, and survival. The legacy of exhaustion was written in stone and flesh. Buildings bore evidence of night labor. Towers constructed under moonlight, streets repaired in long hours of quiet effort, and walls painted or carved while candle flames flickered. Laborers' hands, calloused and trembling from extended workdays, left marks of endurance on tools, manuscripts, and finished projects. Every physical object, from a simple plow to an ornate cathedral, carried the echo of fatigue, a testimony to the human capacity to persist despite the relentless erosion of rest. Memory itself was shaped by sleeplessness. Events recorded in chronicles, letters, or oral histories were filtered through weary eyes. Details were exaggerated or omitted, emotions heightened, and the passage of time distorted. A raid on a village could seem longer, darker, and more terrifying when witnessed by those who had barely slept. A festival could feel almost transcendent in the haze of exhaustion. The stories of everyday life were colored by fatigue, shaping the collective memory that would endure for generations. In this way, sleep deprivation not only influenced perception, but also framed the narrative of history itself. Exhaustion also intertwined with mortality. Chronic fatigue weakened bodies, leaving people vulnerable to disease, injury, and early death. Infants, elderly individuals, and the ill were particularly at risk, their survival often depending on the vigilance of others equally tired. Communities developed coping mechanisms, shared childcare, rotating night duties, and strategic rest for the strongest. These adaptations allowed survival, but also highlighted the fragile balance between endurance and collapse. Death, like exhaustion, was a constant companion, and medieval society understood it as part of life's rhythm, inseparable from the cycles of labor and vigilance that defined daily existence. Yet, in the midst of relentless fatigue, human ingenuity persisted. Innovations emerged not despite exhaustion, but sometimes because of it. Short, focused bursts of creativity occurred during the twilight hours, when fatigue and wakefulness blurred into one. Scholars, artisans, and monks made discoveries, composed songs, and chronicled events during nights of fragmented rest. Exhaustion acted as both a limiter and a catalyst, narrowing attention while heightening perception of subtleties that rested minds might overlook. In a paradoxical way, sleeplessness fostered moments of insight and achievement that would echo far beyond individual lifetimes. Culturally, sleep deprivation shaped rituals, beliefs, and social norms. Moral frameworks praised endurance, punished perceived weakness, and valorized suffering. Festivals and communal gatherings were framed as extraordinary events that broke the monotony of exhaustion, offering fleeting relief and temporary joy. Superstitions, prayers, and religious practices were adapted to mitigate the risks of sleeplessness, protect the vulnerable, and provide meaning in an unpredictable world. Exhaustion became not merely a condition, but a lens through which society viewed duty, virtue, and devotion. Emotionally, the medieval experience of fatigue left an indelible mark. Love, fear, hope, and grief were intensified by exhaustion. Parents moving through nights with infants, lovers stealing moments in shadowed corners, communities responding to crisis, all experienced emotions in sharper, sometimes harsher tones. Sleep-deprived minds were more sensitive, more reactive, and more attuned to subtle changes in their environment. The emotional landscape of medieval life was therefore inseparable from the rhythm of sleepless nights. Each heartbeat and sigh measured against the constant pressure of fatigue. By the end, it becomes clear that sleep deprivation was not merely a symptom of medieval life. It was a defining element. It shaped morality, influenced creativity, molded social hierarchies, and left traces in history, culture, and memory. Medieval people navigated a world that demanded endurance, adaptation, and resourcefulness, where every hour of rest was fleeting, and every decision was colored by exhaustion. They lived in a continuous tension between survival and collapse, between wakefulness and the fleeting refuge of sleep. And so, the story of sleeplessness in medieval times is not just a tale of fatigue. It is a story of resilience, of adaptation, and of human perseverance in the face of relentless pressure. It is a story of how exhaustion, often invisible and unremarked, quietly shaped life, thought, and society, leaving an enduring imprint on the course of history. For those who lived it, the night was both adversary and teacher, both burden and inspiration, a constant companion that defined the rhythm of existence in a world without pause. And as we step back from this exploration, we are left with the haunting realization that exhaustion is not only a personal struggle, it is a force capable of shaping communities, guiding civilizations, and leaving traces that survive long after the last sleepless night has ended.